Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where justice wasn't blind, it was theatrical, vengeful, and deeply personal. We're going to feudal Japan, but not the Zen gardens, cherry blossoms, and elegant tea ceremonies you've seen on postcards. No, this is the other side. The side where a petty thief might find himself slowly cooked alive for stealing a rice bowl, or where a noble woman could be buried up to her neck and stoned not for betrayal, but for knowing about it and keeping silent. This is a world where shame and spectacle were as powerful as steel, and where the punishment didn't just end your life, it ended your name, your family's honor, your reincarnation. It was designed to echo beyond the grave. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's talk about a punishment so disturbing that it was feared more than death itself, ishikozume. The ritualistic entombment of the guilty, alive, inside a standing tomb of stones. And here's the twist: you didn't have to be a murderer to get it. You could have simply broken the unspoken codes of behavior that governed every breath in samurai society. Imagine this. The year is 1668. Somewhere on the Kii Peninsula, deep in the forest, the winds carry 1,000 cicadas screaming into the muggy summer air. A man not particularly old, maybe in his 40s, is led by silent monks to a clearing. He's calm, but every step he takes, the world grows heavier. His crime? He was a monk himself, a junior attendant who'd been caught in a forbidden relationship with a female novice. Consensual, yes. Romantic, perhaps. But against the codes? Absolutely. Now he's been judged. Not in a courtroom, not with a jury, but by the rules of Shugendo, a mountain ascetic sect that blended Shinto, esoteric Buddhism, and indigenous beliefs. And according to those rules, this wasn't just a crime against the temple, it was a cosmic impurity, something that needed to be sealed away, purged. The punishment is not quick. The man is made to sit in a pit no deeper than the length of his shins. He's placed cross-legged, given a last cup of water, and told to begin his final meditation. Then the stones begin, one by one, laid carefully, deliberately by his fellow monks, encasing him from the sides. First his thighs, then his arms, then his torso. They leave his head exposed. He doesn't scream. That would break the illusion. He just lowers his gaze, lets the insects land on his eyebrows, and waits. The last stone is a flat one. It's placed across the top, like a lid. Now the forest is silent again. The site is not marked. But that's not even the worst part. You see, ishikozume wasn't a universal punishment. It was reserved for religious betrayal monks, priests, women of the inner court. It wasn't meant to kill only the body, it was meant to trap the soul. In a spiritual system, where rebirth depended on purification, this was the ultimate spiritual death. You were sealed off from karma, from prayer, from remembrance. And the public would never know. That was the cruelty. No fame in your punishment, no poetry in your death. Just quiet. But it gets worse. Because if you weren't lucky enough to die quietly, you might end up in the hands of the Tokugawa justice system. And they had crucifixion, but not like you think. In the West, crucifixion was a slow, public process meant to drag out suffering. In Japan, crucifixion was the final act, the cherry on top of a long, excruciating punishment. Here's how it worked. Let's say you were a peasant and you killed someone from a higher caste. First, you'd be paraded naked through the village for days, your head shaved, a sign around your neck reading something like "Murderer of his betters," written in ink mixed with animal blood. You'd be slapped, whipped, spat on, but that was just the warm-up. Once you reached the execution grounds, you'd be strapped to 2 wooden poles forming a cross not nailed but tied. Then, executioners would take short spears and stab you through the sides, not the chest that would be merciful. The spears entered through the ribs, angled upward to puncture the lungs but not immediately kill. Another into the thigh, just below the femoral artery. You would bleed out slowly, eyes open. Families came to watch. Children, too. Vendors would set up around the edges of the execution fields, selling dumplings and dried squid. Some brought rice cakes to throw at the dying criminal as a kind of karmic insult. You were being mocked not only in death, but in the spiritual transition. And depending on your crime, the cross could be left standing for days. Buzzards came, dogs circled. Your body rotted in front of your neighbours. Now, here's the most twisted part. If your family was still alive, they were responsible for cleaning up the corpse, not officials, not undertakers. Your mother, your son, your widow, they'd have to climb the bloodied scaffold, untie your swollen limbs, wash you, and burn the body in silence. It was a form of generational shame punishment that spilled past the individual. But not all punishments were so loud. Some were quiet death by enforced seclusion, also called hikikomori execution, a sentence reserved for noble women or high-ranking retainers. The convicted would be locked inside a single room, windowless, for days, weeks, sometimes months. Food would be passed through a slit in the door. No human contact, no sound. You could meditate, you could scream. It didn't matter. Eventually, your body just gave up. And when it did, the only sound you'd hear would be the creaking door opening once to collect you. If the executioner wanted to be symbolic, he might place a tiny paper lantern in the cell. It would burn itself out long before your mind did. Still with me? Now, you might be wondering, what did someone have to do to deserve that? Surely, these were crimes of treason, murder, betrayal. Not always. One documented case involved a woman named Lady Keio, who allegedly insulted a daimyo's concubine by calling her kimono suitable for a brothel. No proof she said it, no trial. But Lady Keio was disappeared into a locked room with 1 futon, 1 bowl of water, and no future. Her family wasn't even told where she died. Her body was never returned. That brings us to one of the most disturbing concepts in Japanese feudal punishment, the idea of tsumi, or spiritual pollution. In the West, we think of justice as a consequence of action, crime, motive, evidence. But in the Japanese feudal context, especially under Shinto-Buddhist syncretism, a person could be punished for existing in a state of impurity. You could become unclean by birth, by association, or even by witnessing something you shouldn't have seen. That's why entire families were sometimes punished for a single member's crime. Not because they were guilty, but because they were spiritually contaminated. There's one recorded case in the Edo period. A teenage boy steals from a merchant's cart. He's caught, whipped, and confesses. But he's from a bad lineage, a bloodline once accused of harbouring a heretical sect. So what happens? His entire household is relocated to the city outskirts, given black-marked documents, and forbidden from holding jobs in commerce, education, or governance. His sisters are unable to marry. His mother is forbidden from entering temples. His father, once a mid-ranking samurai, is stripped of his title and forced to work as a manure porter, carrying buckets of human waste through the streets in broad daylight. That boy died at 15. But his punishment lived for generations. And that was the point. These weren't just punishments, they were warnings. Living billboards of obedience. Don't steal, don't speak, don't question the hierarchy. Because in this world, the wrong word could get you buried standing up and forgotten while alive. But this is just the beginning. We haven't even gotten to the boiling cauldrons yet, or the 1,000-slice execution, or the secret punishment chambers beneath Edo Castle where nobles were kept alive without light, teeth, or language. We'll get there. Let's sit with this for a moment. The sound of a stone sliding over soft earth. The weight of judgment in a society where silence was more lethal than the sword. And the knowledge that in ancient Japan, punishment wasn't just about death. It was about making sure you didn't come back. The smell hits first. Imagine rice vinegar, human blood, and wet iron. The copper tang of sweat mixed with the sour reek of old hemp robes stained from the last man who stood here. That's the first thing you'd notice in the Kogisho, the interrogation rooms beneath the magistrate's office in Edo. Not courtrooms, not dungeons. These were quiet, hidden places. No windows. Just straw mats, coils of rope, and 3 tools that decided whether your day ended in confession or in pieces. They were called the Sanmitsu no Kei, the 3 close tortures, and you could be subjected to them whether you were guilty or not. Let's say you're a merchant accused of counterfeiting Koban coins. The magistrate brings you in. You say you're innocent. There are no witnesses, no proof, but your story contradicts a senior official's. That's enough. First, they bind your wrists together behind your back with kubinawa, a hemp rope soaked in cold water. Then, they insert a wedge, usually made of oak or bamboo, between your knees and ankles. It's about 2 fingers thick. Then, the pressing begins. With each crank of the wedge, your joints are compressed. Your knees begin to scream. The bones don't break, not yet, but your cartilage grinds. Tendons stretch. And here's the psychological part. A scribe sits calmly next to you, brush ready, waiting to write down your confession the moment you cave. Every scream? Irrelevant. All that matters is the moment you beg for ink. But some didn't confess. That's when Ebazim started the shrimp torture. Named because of the way your body arches backward, like a cooked prawn. You're strapped face up to a wooden plank. Ropes around your ankles and shoulders. Then they begin to tighten the ropes, pulling your body into a bow. It doesn't look deadly, but your back starts to spasm. Muscles seize. Blood flow chokes itself off. Your vision narrows. Some lost control of their bowels. Some lost consciousness. One scribe noted that, after the 4th rope, most men hallucinate voices from their ancestors. Still not enough? That's when they brought out the Ishidaki, the stone embrace. Large, smooth rocks, heated in fire, were placed on your thighs, chest, and belly while you remained tied in position. Slowly, one by one. It wasn't about burns, it was about weight. The heat made you squirm. The weight made you stay still. If you moved, the stones rolled. One to the groin, one to the throat. There was no safe position. Confession rates were nearly total. But the real twist? None of this was illegal. Under Tokugawa law, confession was considered superior to evidence. Without it, even if you were caught red-handed, your sentence could be light. With it, execution, exile, family dishonor, land seizure, all could be justified. And some confessions were extracted ahead of schedule. Take the case of Kawamoto Ichi, a stable boy, arrested in 1723. A horse had gone missing, later found butchered in a forest, his lord's prized mare. Ichi was suspected because he once complained about being overworked. That was it. No theft history, no enemies, no blood on his clothes. But he was low caste. He was tied to a koshiki ishi, a thick wooden saddle used to break horses. 2 guards forced him to kneel on it, then added bricks, one at a time, to his outstretched arms. For 3 hours he held his position. The magistrate offered him water if he confessed. He refused. They added more bricks. His arms shook, veins burst. Eventually, one arm snapped clean, mid-bicep. He screamed, and then he confessed. Not to killing the horse, but to stealing rice. A confession to anything so long as it ended. He was sentenced to tataki no keibatsu, the beating penalty. But his arms were already useless. He died in custody 2 days later. His confession was never verified. But what if you were rich or powerful? Surely they were spared? Yes, in a way. But that came with its own nightmare. Honor, execution. When a samurai disgraced himself gambling debts, cowardice in battle, or political betrayal, he could be offered the chance to perform seppuku, the ritual suicide that Hollywood loves to dramatize, but rarely gets right. You think you know how it worked. Kneel, stab, bow out. Not quite. In real practice, seppuku was a slow, deliberate performance, and it wasn't always voluntary. You were dressed in white. You were given sake, sometimes a poem, a final meal, if the crime wasn't too severe. And then, kneeling before an audience, you took a tanto, a short ceremonial dagger, and sliced across your abdomen, left to right, not deep enough to kill, then up. The vertical cut was the hard part. It sliced muscle from sternum to navel. At this point, most men began to black out. That's when the kaishakunin, your second, stepped forward with a katana to decapitate you in one blow. Clean, merciful. That was the best case scenario. But not all kaishakunin were kind. Some let the agony linger. Some missed on purpose. One recorded case from 1682 tells of a man whose head was only half severed, left dangling by skin and sinew for 5 full minutes while he gurgled and thrashed. The second was later punished, not for cruelty, but for lack of precision. Now let's talk about women. Feudal Japan had a particularly cruel form of punishment reserved for noble women who committed adultery or conspired against their lords. It was called kubishime, to ishibari strangulation, followed by burial under a stone slab. First, the woman would be bound in fine silk, her head covered with white cloth. Then a thick braided rope, often the same used in temple ceremonies, was wrapped around her neck. She'd be held upright by 2 attendants, while a third slowly tightened the rope from behind. The idea was to slowly compress the throat, not crush it, allowing her the full range of emotion, regret, fear, shame before oxygen left the brain. The burial happened immediately after, not in a grave, but beneath a flat memorial stone, often inscribed with a name that wasn't hers. A complete erasure. In one case, from 1799, Lady Matsu, a concubine accused of poisoning a rival, was buried beneath a koi pond inside her own villa. The fish would circle over her final resting place. Her family was ordered never to rebuild. And then there's hikoko, the punishment of exile, without destination. Used rarely, and only for samurai or monks who'd offended without committing an actual crime. This was psychological annihilation. The condemned would be shaved, dressed in ragged peasant robes, and given a staff with a tag that read, "No master, no home." They were then led out of the city and told to walk, no food, no destination. No place was allowed to take them in. They were erased from records, from temple prayers, from family registers, in a society built entirely on community and role to be without name or place was to already be dead. Some wandered for years, others starved within days. The purpose was never to kill the body, it was to kill the idea of the person. And now we come to the most symbolic punishment of all haritsuke, or crucifixion with arrows, reserved for Christians and religious heretics during the early Edo crackdown. The cross was different here, shorter, with the arms outstretched but not fully horizontal. The condemned was tied, not nailed. A priest would read a charge aloud for bringing foreign corruption or for preaching outside the law. Then, instead of being left to hang, executioners would shoot arrows into the body, starting at the hands, moving to the feet, then the thighs, then the stomach. Always symmetrical, always precise. The goal wasn't death, the goal was display. Missionaries reported the smell of burnt flesh as arrows were heated before impact. Victims often lived for hours, even after a dozen or more arrows pierced their bodies. And the worst part? The arrows weren't removed. The bodies were left on display for days, a warning to those who held forbidden beliefs. The arrows fluttered in the wind, like grotesque flags. This wasn't punishment for what you did. It was punishment for who you were. And that's the truth of feudal justice. It wasn't blind. It had many eyes. It saw your class, your ancestry, your religion, your silence, and it acted accordingly. One rule for the peasant, one for the samurai, another for the priest, and another still for the woman who dared to love outside of caste. And now that we've sat with this, felt the ropes, the fire, the judgment, let's go one step deeper. Because what happens when punishment becomes entertainment? What happens when the execution ground becomes the town square? In the next section, we'll go there. We'll enter the public theatres of pain, the laughing crowds, the children with sweets, the woman who became a living example, chained to a pillar for 17 days until her skin came off in strips. But for now, breathe. Let the shadows settle. Because in ancient Japan, death was never the end. It was the beginning of a lesson. Let's walk together now down a dusty street in Edo, the smell of roasted chestnuts and charcoal in the air. It's early morning, but there's already a crowd gathering just beyond the bridge near Suzugamori, one of the city's official execution grounds. If you're wondering how many of these there were, the answer is a lot. Edo had 3 major execution sites, plus countless temporary grounds that popped up depending on the season and the need. And yes, punishment here had seasons. Summer was better for beheadings. The bodies decomposed quickly and were easier to dispose of. Winter, ironically, was reserved for prolonged tortures. The cold slowed death, extended the agony, and made for more disciplined viewing. Now, today's crowd isn't here for a simple sword strike. They've gathered for a different kind of show, a punishment spectacle. These weren't just about killing, they were about performing the state's moral order. An execution was a community event, almost spiritual in its rhythm. Vendors sell sake. Children play with paper pinwheels. A monk chants in the distance, not for mercy, but to announce the righteousness of law, and then the condemned is brought out. Today it's a woman, young, barefoot. Her name is Okiku, and her crime isn't murder, or theft, or treason. It's abortion. Now, under Tokugawa law, abortion wasn't strictly illegal, but it became punishable when used to hide adultery, especially if it disrupted samurai lineage. In this case, Okiku had been a maid to a mid-ranking retainer. She was impregnated by his son, and after the child was gone, the family claimed it had been a plot to entrap the heir. A convenient accusation. No trial, no defense. Just a sentence. Public restraint and humiliation for 17 days, followed by death by drowning. They call it misedashi, showing to the public. She's stripped to the waist, roped to a cedar post at the center of the square, with signs hung from her neck. Betrayer of womb, defiler of house. People walk by, some stop. Some throw small pebbles at her feet, others spit, but the worst are the curious ones, the ones who just stand, watching, sipping broth like they're reading a novel. At night, she isn't unbound. She's given a single blanket and a bowl of rice. Guards make jokes. Sometimes the local children are dared to touch her. One does. She doesn't flinch. On the 17th morning, she's untied, barely able to stand, legs swollen, wrists bleeding where the rope has torn through. She's brought to the river, tied again, and dropped into a shallow pool until the bubbles stop. Then she's lifted, paraded once more, and finally burned. That was entertainment. But don't assume this was unique to her. There was a catalogue of punishments designed for maximum public visibility, with different levels based on your caste and gender. Let's explore a few. 1. Sarashi exposure. This was one of the most humiliating punishments, the Japanese equivalent of the medieval pillory. Offenders were tied to a post with signs explaining their crimes. Some were shaved bald. Others had ink drawn across their faces, blackened teeth for liars, red circles for thieves, slashes for false priests. Women accused of adultery were often tied in sitting position, legs folded beneath them, palms open, as if offering shame to the community. Punishment length varied. Some were held for 3 hours, others 3 days. But the worst part? You were never alone. There were professional mockers, hired jeerers, who led the crowd in ridicule. Some had drums, others used flutes or gongs. They would chant insults, write crude songs, encourage children to repeat them. It wasn't just about shame, it was about recording that shame in collective memory. 2. Kuzure degradation parade. A direct ancestor to the perp walk, Kuja involved, tying the offender with slack rope and parading them barefoot through town, usually used for debtors, drunkards, or those who insulted authority. They were led by a small procession, a crier, a drummer, and a minor official carrying a scroll announcing the offence. One particularly cruel version, known as Aim no Kuza, was done in the rain. The soaked robes became transparent. It wasn't enough for the body to suffer, it had to be humiliated. 3. Inugoya Keibatsu, dog kennel penalty. Yes, this is real. Certain repeat offenders were sentenced to live in makeshift outdoor cages, open bamboo pens that mimicked the construction of a dog kennel. The offender was shackled, given food through slats, and forced to relieve themselves in front of passers-by. Some lasted a week, others only days before collapsing from exposure. In one notorious 1761 case, a Buddhist monk caught embezzling temple funds was kept in such a pen for 11 days. By the end, he was barking like a dog, not out of mockery, but because his mind had fractured. 4. Tsurushi suspension. This wasn't hanging. This was suspension by the ankles or wrists, often over a pit of filth, mud, or coals. The body would contort, blood would rush to the head, muscles would cramp. And if you passed out, a bucket of cold water would wake you right back up. One variant, used on smugglers, involved rotating the suspended body slowly over a brazier of burning incense. The smoke rose directly into the eyes and nostrils. Eventually, the skin around the eyes would blister. Some went blind. But again, all of this was public. The idea wasn't just deterrence, it was instruction. A living textbook of moral consequence, written in bruises and blisters. And that brings us to perhaps the most infamous of all, the 1,000 cuts. Now technically, Linqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, is Chinese in origin, but records show that a modified version was used in Japan during early feudal periods and whispered about for centuries after. The Japanese variation involved hundreds of shallow cuts, arms, thighs, back, chest, spaced over hours. Used only for high treason, it was almost ritualistic. A scroll was read aloud with each slice. Not the crime, but the betrayed virtues. Loyalty, restraint, filial piety. Each cut was not random. It symbolized a failed virtue. The body became a living tapestry of your moral collapse. The final blow was to the throat, but by then, the mind was often long gone. And here's where things get eerie. There are woodblock prints of these executions, highly detailed. Blood inked in red, flesh shown in layers. Some were sold as souvenirs, others were posted at town gates. But one detail appears again and again, the eyes of the condemned always looking at the viewer. A final, unblinking plea. What does all this say? That punishment in feudal Japan wasn't just a tool of control, it was a mirror. It reflected the values, fears, and obsessions of an entire culture. Obedience, honor, shame, spiritual pollution, and more than anything, community enforcement. You weren't just punished by the state, you were punished by your neighbors, your friends. The child who watched you scream while licking syrup off a stick. And this culture of public spectacle didn't end with death. It continued. Some were burned, others beheaded. And the heads? They were boiled in salt water to preserve them, mounted on stakes, and displayed at crossroads. A samurai's head would be washed, hair combed, face powdered, then displayed with a placard listing their lineage and crime. Sometimes enemies would be forced to bow before these severed heads as a sign of respect and warning. There's even one recorded incident of a severed head being promoted. An executed warrior's bravery was so admired that, after death, his name was honored and his family given titles. His body was gone. His face remained, and his punishment became his glory. It's surreal, contradictory, gruesome, and completely human, because at the core of these punishments was a single idea: memory through pain. The pain of the punished, the pain of the witnesses, the pain of being told, this could be you. In the next section, we'll explore what happened behind palace doors, the secret, private punishments for courtiers and nobles, the dismemberments that never reached the public eye, the poisons that made you bleed from the eyes, the punishments reserved not for breaking law, but for breaking silence. But for now, let the echoes fade. You're standing at the edge of a scaffold. The crowd is quiet now. The drum has stopped. And somewhere, a child is asking if they'll have sweet rice cakes tomorrow. Because for them, this was just another day. Now close your eyes. You're not on a scaffold anymore. There's no crowd, no shouting, no vendors, no ceremonial drums. You're in a hallway, dark, silent, lined with sliding doors made of painted rice paper. A faint scent of camellia oil and damp cedar hangs in the air. Footsteps echo softly on tatami mats. This is the oku, the great interior, the inner chambers of Edo Castle where the shogun's women lived, hundreds of them. Wives, concubines, maidservants, midwives, and every one of them forbidden from ever leaving. This is not prison, this is power. And it came with its own set of laws, laws not written by magistrates, but by gossip, jealousy, and the ruthless maintenance of absolute control. Break those laws, and you wouldn't be dragged to a town square. You'd simply vanish. Let me introduce you to Okino, a chambermaid assigned to Lady Tsukiko, one of the favoured concubines of Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu in the early 18th century. Okino was bright, graceful, and fluent in classical Chinese poetry, an unusual skill. Her job was simple: keep Lady Tsukiko's calligraphy set clean, fetch water, maintain her dressing mirror. But one morning, Lady Tsukiko found a single folded letter tucked into her ink case. A love poem. Not from her, not addressed to her, it had been misplaced, slipped from Okino's sleeve. The sender? A palace page boy. A forbidden relationship. The punishment came quickly. No trial, no announcement. Okino was summoned to the hidden annex, a bare wooden room with no window and no name. She was offered one choice: drink or bleed. If she chose the cup, usually containing torikabuto, a poisonous monk's hood extract, she would die quietly and her family would be spared. If she refused, she'd be bled small cuts along the thighs, under the arms, behind the ears, enough to cause collapse, not death. Then she would be exiled alive to Tokaji, a nunnery that doubled as a graveyard for fallen court women. Okino drank. Her death was never recorded. Her body was removed at dawn in a sealed palanquin, her name erased from all court documents. And that's how palace justice worked. There was no need for spectacle, only silence. But it wasn't just women. High-ranking retainers, advisors, even daimyo provincial lords were subject to private punishments. And the higher you stood, the more elegant your fall. Take Lord Naito Nobumasa, a loyal vassal who served under Shogun Ieyasu. In 1645, he was discovered conspiring to support an imperial faction in Kyoto, politically dangerous, though not outright treason. The shogun didn't want scandal, so instead of public execution, he summoned Naito for tea. The conversation was polite, incense was lit, music played softly in the next room. At the end of the meeting, the shogun handed him a letter. Inside was a wakizashi, a short blade wrapped in white silk. Nothing else was said. Naito bowed, returned to his estate. That night, he wrote a final poem. The next morning, he disemboweled himself in front of his ancestral altar, surrounded by retainers, dressed in ceremonial black. His head was not removed. It was placed in a black lacquered box and delivered back to Edo Castle with a note, loyal to the end. His lands were confiscated, his family demoted, but no one outside court circles ever knew why. This was the Tokugawa genius, punishment without spectacle. They understood something terrifyingly modern, that silence can be more powerful than a scream. If you kill a man in public, the people talk. If he disappears, they wonder. But what about those who weren't noble enough for tea and poems, yet too important for a simple beheading? Enter the world of secret anatomical punishments. In the mid-17th century, a physician named Yamamoto Shogun wrote a private treatise known as the Kage no Kaji, or the Fire in Shadow. It detailed punishments used in the intelligence branches of the Tokugawa regime methods meant not to kill, but to disable the soul. One method involved the removal of fingernails by slow peeling, followed by immersion in brine, laced with ground pepper and powdered chrysanthemum, an herb believed to preserve pain rather than numb it. Another described a punishment called kawamusu, or skin sprouting. The offender would be restrained while soft bamboo shoots were inserted beneath the skin of the forearms and legs. As the bamboo grew slowly, over days it would expand and rupture the surrounding tissue. The offender could live through this for weeks, but they would never walk properly again. Why go to such lengths? Because death erases, but disfigurement teaches. If you saw a former court official limping through the streets of Osaka, sleeves always covering his arms, never speaking of what he saw you knew, you didn't need to ask. Now let's talk about verbal punishment. Yes, it existed. Under strict Confucian codes, insulting someone of higher rank was considered not just rude, but a violation of social order. You couldn't shout. You couldn't gossip. You couldn't even make sarcastic poetry about your lord. If you did, the punishment was uniquely psychological. You were ordered to wear a zarei, or regret mask. Carved from wood, painted with exaggerated features, wide, weeping eyes, a sagging mouth, huge ears, the mask was tied to your face with a red cord and worn for 7 days straight. You were paraded through your own neighborhood, sometimes made to sweep streets or bow at doorways, not because you were dangerous, but because you needed to be seen apologizing, and if you removed the mask early, that was considered spiritual dishonor. The penalty: having the image tattooed on your chest permanently. There's a court record of a man named Sakai Jotaro, a young tax scribe in 1728 who wrote a haiku mocking his superior's bald head. Winter moonlight reflects off a dome where no hair dares grow. He was reported forced into the zarei mask. He tried to run, was caught. The mask was branded onto his back with hot iron. His poetry career ended there. But the most chilling punishments weren't physical. They were spiritual erasures. Let me explain. The Japanese concept of kegare, or pollution, wasn't just about dirt or crime. It was about spiritual contamination from death, from taboo, from broken societal roles. Some people, upon breaking these taboos, weren't punished with pain or exile. They were punished with social invisibility. In practice, this meant becoming a burakumin, an outcast. You could be stripped of your name, denied temple burial, banned from entering markets, forbidden to wear certain fabrics or walk through main gates. No one could speak to you except other outcasts. Children threw stones, priests averted their gaze. This wasn't done to criminals. It was done to truth-tellers. A page boy who revealed a noble's abuse of a concubine, a monk who tried to report financial fraud at a temple, a wife who uncovered her lord's hidden Christian shrine. These weren't heroes, they were pollutants. And so, the punishment wasn't death, it was being alive and untouchable. And they didn't scream. They begged for acknowledgement. For someone to say their name. None did. Now let's pause. Because all of this, the poison, the silence, the masks, the disappearing, paints a picture that's very different from the popular image of samurai justice. It wasn't all sword fights and stoic honor. It was bureaucracy, fear, inescapable hierarchy, and the terrifying power of controlled perception. You didn't need to burn people at the stake every day. You just had to burn one and make sure everyone remembered it the right way. That was the genius of Tokugawa punishment. It was cultural programming, repetition, symbolism, making shame and obedience feel natural, inevitable, even righteous. So when we talk about punishment in ancient Japan, We're not just talking about execution methods. We're talking about a civilization that turned control into ritual and obedience into art. In the next section, we'll dive into the final, most secret punishment ever recorded under the Tokugawa regime, a fate so surreal that some historians still argue it never really happened. A man was turned into a living scarecrow, nailed upright in the mountains, eyes sewn open, left to guard a trail where no one was allowed to walk. But first, sit in this silence. The kind of silence that hides footsteps behind paper walls. Because here, behind the sliding doors of power, no one screams. They only disappear. They called him Tatabari Otoko, the nailed man. And, whether or not he truly existed, the Tokugawa court had a phrase for it, mukozeme, the punishment beyond the road. A sentence so severe, so outside the bounds of written law, that it could not be declared publicly. A punishment for a man whose crime wasn't theft, or violence, or rebellion, but reminding people that the law itself could be wrong. Let me take you to the Kizo Mountains, central Honshu dense with pines, ghost thick with fog, paths so narrow a horse can barely pass. It's the late 1600s. A mountain village receives shipments of iron and salt, critical for the shogunate's trade network. A tiny place with a big responsibility, and a local official, let's call him Masuda, begins rerouting supplies. Slowly at first, then brazenly, the peasants complain. They starve. Masuda thrives. Enter a man named Hajime, a cart puller, not a samurai, not a monk, just strong-backed and stubborn. One day, he finds a document in a broken shipment box, a ledger. Proof of Masuda's thefts, stamped with the wrong seal. He takes it to the regional administrator. He expects thanks. Instead, he's arrested. You see, Masuda is protected, and Hajime has done the unthinkable. Exposed a crack in the hierarchy. He didn't just point out corruption, he made the system look foolish. That was unforgivable. He's removed from records, his family is relocated, and then begins a punishment not found in any official scroll. He is turned into a warning. They take him into the mountains, strip him, drive iron nails through his calves, into a thick cedar plank, then his forearms, then his shoulders, not to hang him, but to fasten him upright, cruciform, like a scarecrow. His eyes are sewn open with black thread soaked in brine. His lips are split and spread with thin bamboo pegs. A small bowl of rice is placed at his feet, symbolic mercy. He is left like that for 6 days. Villagers are told not to look, not to speak his name, but they do. Children sneak through the woods at night. They see him standing there, face swollen, flesh bloated, birds nesting in the crook of his elbows. On the 7th day, he's gone. No one knows what happened to his body, but the trail where he stood was declared cursed. Trade routes were diverted. The cedar tree behind him, the one into which the nails had sunk, was later found dead from the roots up. And yet, this wasn't the only tale of its kind. Other records, unofficial, fragmentary speak of similar fates. Men tied to plum trees, their ears cut and inserted into their mouths. Women shaved bald, painted with ink, and displayed in cages outside city walls to watch the road, believed to ward off treason. But let's zoom out for a second. Why did these extreme punishments exist off the books? Because sometimes law fails culture, and when the official system couldn't account for emotional crimes, betrayal, dishonor, humiliation, these off-record punishments filled the gap. They were ceremonies of fear, sacred in their secrecy, passed through generations as warnings. Now let me tell you about Yorezim ghost punishment. Not torture of the body, torture of the spirit. In 1714, a woman named Sai is accused of poisoning her husband, a failed Ronin. There's no evidence, but his family is wealthy, powerful, and so Sai is subjected to living isolation, kept in a temple annex, forbidden to speak, eat, or be seen. Each morning, a monk enters, places one bowl of white rice in front of her, removes it uneaten at dusk. This continues for 17 days. No contact, no explanation. The room is lit by a single candle, replaced nightly. She sees no faces. August 1845. Two ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, glide from the Thames, carrying 129 men, nearly all of them volunteers, officers, engineers, sailors, even a dog. Their mission? To find the fabled Northwest Passage, a shortcut through the Arctic that would revolutionize trade between the Atlantic and Pacific. At the helm of this expedition was Sir John Franklin, an experienced explorer in his 60s, known both for his bravery and his stubbornness. He was a man who had already nearly died in Canada once before, resorting to eating lichen and boiled leather to survive, and now he was going back with better technology, more supplies, and more pride. Their ships were state-of-the-art. They carried 3 years' worth of food, including over 8,000 tins of preserved meat and vegetables, a new invention. They had steam engines, coal reserves, a full library, silver cutlery, and hand-stitched uniforms designed for Arctic formality. They even had a printing press on board. They were prepared for everything, except reality, because after the Erebus and Terror were last spotted by a whaling ship off Greenland, they vanished. No survivors, no messages, no graves. Just silence cold, white silence that lasted over a century and a half. So what happened? Let's walk it, slowly, hypothermically. First, the supplies. Those tins of meat, mass-produced in haste by a contractor who cut corners, soldered shut with lead, which bled into the food. By the time the crew entered the thick Arctic maze of ice channels, many of them were already experiencing lead poisoning, fatigue, confusion, vomiting, and worst of all, cognitive breakdown. Imagine trying to navigate a frozen, shifting labyrinth when your hands shake, your teeth ache, and you no longer trust what you see. Then came the ice. The ships became trapped, not crushed, but locked in the Victoria Strait, frozen in place, and there they remained, for over a year. Imagine it. The sky never fully dark, the sun circling at a low, mocking angle, the ice groaning beneath you like something alive. Nothing to do, nowhere to go. Morale slowly dissolving. They tried to wait it out, hunted what they could, read, wrote letters, drank. But as the months dragged on, the lead grew heavier in their blood, the food ran low, and the water systems, melted snow, filtered through lead piping, only made it worse. Then men began to die. No violence, no fanfare, just quietly, in their bunks. A record found later would list the first deaths in June of 1847, 2 officers, then 5 crewmen, then Franklin himself. That's right. Sir John Franklin died before the expedition truly failed. With their leader gone, command fell to Francis Crozier, a brooding Irish officer with polar experience and a deep distrust of the British Admiralty. He understood something the others didn't. They weren't going to be rescued. So in April of 1848, Crozier made the call. Abandon the ships. Imagine the desperation behind that order, walking across hundreds of miles of Arctic tundra, dragging sledges filled with supplies, hoping to reach a Hudson Bay Company outpost no one was even sure existed. It was suicide, but staying was death. They left behind notes, scattered artifacts. The famous Victory Point note, found years later in a cairn, reads, April 25th, 1848. HMS Terror and Erebus deserted. The death of Sir John Franklin occurred on 11th June, 1847. Total loss by deaths to this date, 9 officers and 15 men. That was it. No drama, just a quiet report of collapse. Now let's talk about the real horror. Because when later search teams discovered human remains, bones, strewn across King William Island, they noticed something chilling. Cut marks. Long, clean incisions on the ends of femurs. Scrapes along rib cages. Signs that were unmistakable. Butchering. Some bones had been cracked open, marrow removed. The men had resorted to cannibalism. This wasn't just grim. It was heresy to Victorian sensibilities. The Royal Navy was an empire of order, hierarchy, and ritual. Cannibalism? That was savagery. That was what uncivilized people did. But in the Arctic, cold doesn't care about empire. We now know that by the time the men began their long march south, many were already dying before they walked. Some had scurvy, their lemon juice supply improperly stored. Others had pneumonia, frostbite, dysentery. But the most dangerous illness was doubt. Because when hope dies, discipline dies with it. One recovered sledge was found to contain silverware, books, and buttoned uniforms, but no extra food, no fuel. They were dragging symbols of status across the tundra while starving. It's one of the most devastating metaphors in all of exploration. They couldn't let go of the trappings of civilization, even as it killed them. And then there's the Inuit, the local people, the Netzilik, who saw the strange white men stumbling across the ice in layered coats, dragging sleds, speaking gibberish, refusing to adapt. Some were given food, others were feared. Inuit oral histories tell of men who sat by their boats and wouldn't move, even as their lips turned blue. One account describes a man who refused seal meat and instead tried to eat his leather glove. Another tells of a man whose mouth was frozen open, teeth black with rot, staring at nothing. The Inuit did not interfere. They didn't need to. The Arctic was already doing its job. It wasn't until the 20th century, and then again in 2014 and 2016, that the wrecks of the Erebus and Terror were found, perfectly preserved beneath the icy depths, ghost ships, cabinets still intact, boots neatly arranged by cots, a tomb. The ships had drifted south, likely due to thawing ice, and settled quietly on the ocean floor, still, silent, as if waiting. And what did we learn? That no amount of pride, preparation, or polished silver can outmatch nature. That men who believed they were conquering the Arctic were instead erased by it. And that somewhere, on a desolate stretch of frozen rock, lie the last footprints of men who wanted nothing more than to be remembered and were, not as heroes, but as a cautionary tale. In the next section, we'll go deeper into the forensic details. What the bodies told us, the man whose mouth was stuffed with human muscle, the boots made of skin, the sailor who died with his commanding officer's initials carved into his thigh. But for now, drift here. Feel the ice in your lungs, the silence pressing against your ears like deep water, and know that, for 129 men, the world ended not in fire, but in frost. and we are the only warmth they have left. Now imagine opening a grave. It's 1880, 136 years after Franklin's ships vanished. A team of explorers, led by Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka, has found the skeletal remains of a man lying face down on King William Island. No coffin, no prayer. Just a bleached ribcage and skull, barely covered in snow-blown gravel. As they lift the bones, something falls out from beneath the ribs. A silver spoon, stamped with initials, not the dead man's initials, someone else's. And then they see the femur. It's been sawn clean through, the ends blackened as if scorched. The marrow cavity is hollowed out, scraped. Around the site, more bones, some cracked open, some with knife marks along the joint lines. This isn't battlefield damage. This is butchery. And it wasn't a one-time event. As forensic teams later confirmed using both historical records and modern analysis, at least 24 individuals from the Franklin expedition show evidence of post-mortem modification. Skin peeled, joints disarticulated, muscle removed. In some cases, bones smashed to reach marrow. Let's pause for a moment, not out of judgment, but to feel the full, terrible weight of this. Because these were Royal Navy men, bound by hierarchy, ritual, and pride. The very idea of breaking rank was enough to shame your family for generations. And yet, here they were, not in one place, but in dozens of scattered sites eating each other. But it gets worse, because the damage wasn't surgical. It was messy, rushed, desperate. Flesh removed not with precision, but with panic. Some cuts appear half-finished, others repeated, as if the person sawing couldn't complete the act the first time. There are even bones where tooth marks are present human, not animal. One forensic pathologist described it as a spectrum of denial. Some sailors tried to cut meat as if preparing pork. Others tore it apart with their hands. And at least one, judging by the gastric acid stains found inside a set of rib bones, cooked it. Which brings us to the cook's tent. In 1981, an excavation led by anthropologist Owen Beatty uncovered a cooking area on the western coast of King William Island. Inside, charred bones, ashes mixed with human hair, and most disturbingly, a boiled boot. Why boil a boot? Because when all else fails, leather becomes calories. Even if it's soaked with urine, coated in ice mold, and hardened by salt water, you chew until your teeth crack, swallow until your gut refuses. And then you go for something softer, like a thigh. But here's where the nightmare gets philosophical. Because mixed among these bones were silver spoons, personal buttons, medals, Bible pages. In one case, the remains of a sailor were found with his commander's insignia sewn into his coat, a coat far too large for him. Had he taken it after the officer died? Or was it given in some last act of dignity? No one knows. And that's the tragedy. No one left a confession, just the aftermath. There's a set of remains referred to as the officer at Erebus Bay, identified by high lead levels, polished teeth, and pristine uniform fragments. Found in a hollow beneath a cairn, arms crossed neatly, buttons aligned. But beneath his body, a shattered tibia, sawed, split, cooked. Was he the victim, or the one who prepared the meal? Some researchers believe officers were targeted first, not out of malice, but because they had the best gear, the cleanest bodies, the most fat. Others suggest the opposite, that the officers took control of the food, rationed it unjustly, and were killed in retaliation. We'll never know, because the Arctic doesn't leave answers, only evidence of collapse. And that brings us to the most disturbing discovery of all. In two separate camps, explorers recovered skeletons with strange incisions around the face, lips missing, cheeks sliced, tongues removed. These weren't simple carvings for meat, they were symbolic, ritualistic. One skull unearthed in 1986 bore drill marks along the temple, possibly made with an improvised tool. There was no medical reason, only speculation. Had the survivors, in a final moment of madness, tried to release the soul? Or was it punishment? Was someone blamed for their fate, accused of leading them astray, cursed as a Jonah? Did they kill him as a scapegoat? Or worse, was it done posthumously, a final act of fear-driven superstition? Because in some Inuit traditions, a spirit cannot pass if its body is incomplete. Maybe they thought they were helping, or maybe they were trying to keep it from returning. And then there's the record of boots made from human skin. It sounds like horror fiction, but fragments of tanned hide recovered from campsites show distinct follicle patterns consistent with human epidermis, stitched with sinew, lined with fur, fashioned crudely into soles. Probably done late after months on foot when no other materials remained. The bodies were failing. The minds had already gone. By the end, discipline no longer existed. Hierarchy collapsed. What remained was something older, primal. Men fought over bones, not ranks. Over boiled water, not orders. This wasn't mutiny. It was devolution. And the Arctic? It didn't watch. It didn't judge. It just kept freezing. Even now, the site where the final group is believed to have died, a desolate slope facing the sea, is marked only by a few scattered stones and fragments of bone, half buried in lichen and thyme. No monuments, no graves, just evidence. The lead, for instance, we now know it built up not just from the tins, but from the ship's plumbing, their coffee pots, their condensers. Their blood turned to toxic sludge, thick and slow. It dulled their reflexes, made wounds fester, fractured their judgment. They didn't just freeze. They poisoned themselves slowly, politely, while saluting the flag. And even in death, they tried to maintain their dignity. One of the last recovered bodies was found propped up, arms crossed, face turned toward the ocean. Someone had placed a comb in his hand. His boots were missing. He had no name tag, but someone had written on the inside of his coat, "Forgive me." That's it. 2 words, scratched into wool with a rusted sewing needle. Forgive me. And in that phrase lives everything. The fear, the hunger, the regret. The moment when the story becomes something you can't explain anymore. Not to God, not to empire, not to the men dying next to you. Just silence. So what does it all mean? That exploration is not conquest. That cold doesn't bargain. That empire can bring silver spoons into the Arctic, but the ice always eats last. And that the greatest terror isn't death. It's the moment when you realize no one is coming. In the next section, we'll look at the legacy of the Franklin expedition, how it shaped Victorian myth, fueled decades of search missions, inspired false leads, ghost stories, and a public that refused to believe their heroes became cannibals. But for now, rest. There's frost in your lungs, and a spoon still warm from another man's pocket. And the wind is whispering in a voice you almost recognize. Let's begin in London, 1854. 9 years after Franklin's ships vanished into Arctic silence, the city is buzzing with whispers. Parliament halls echo with debate. The newspapers are filled with speculation. Lady Jane Franklin, the explorer's iron-willed widow, has just returned from another failed search mission, and she's demanding that the government fund another. But this time, the rumors are different. This time, a man has returned from the ice with a story. His name is John Ray, a Scottish surgeon and explorer working for the Hudson's Bay Company. He's travelled thousands of miles across Canada's northern coast, slept in snow holes, hunted with the Inuit, eaten raw seal, and survived storms that would kill most trained officers. He's also the first European to uncover the truth. Ray has spoken with multiple Inuit hunters near the Boothia Peninsula who claim to have seen white men dragging sleds, dying slowly. The Inuit show him relics, silver forks, a compass, a telescope, all traced back to the Erebus and Terror. But more chilling is what they describe. Some of the bodies had been cut, with flesh removed from the limbs. Ray doesn't flinch. He includes this in his official report to the Admiralty, measured, clinical, and undeniable. And London erupts. Because Ray hasn't just found evidence of the expedition's fate. He's accused British naval heroes of cannibalism. The backlash is instant. The Royal Navy rejects his findings. The public turns on him. Cartoonists mock him in the papers. One depicts Franklin's officers sitting at a table surrounded by Inuit, gnawing on each other's arms. It's grotesque. And the insult cuts deeper, because Ray himself was half Orcadian, seen as an outsider, less proper than the officers he's accused of dying like animals. And then comes the real blow. Charles Dickens. Yes, that Charles Dickens writes an editorial in Household Words, defending the honour of the British dead and accusing the Inuit of being savages and liars. We believe every savage to be in his heart, covetous, treacherous, and cruel, he writes. The public agrees. They want heroes, not horror. They want Franklin to have died facing the north wind with a Union Jack in his hand, not slumped over a ribcage with blood in his beard. And so begins the myth-making. Franklin is named the discoverer of the Northwest Passage. Even though he never actually found it, memorials are erected. A statue goes up in Waterloo Place, sword drawn, eyes cast nobly toward the Arctic. The real story is locked away. Lady Jane funds her own version, publishing selected letters, cleaned up reports, omitting any mention of what the bones said. She lobbies Parliament, she gives speeches. She rewrites her husband's death as a noble sacrifice. And it works. For decades, Franklin becomes the Arctic's martyred saint. School children memorize his name. Navy ships bear it. His face is printed in textbooks. The cannibalism is buried, spoken of only in hushed academic circles, and even then, always with a perhaps, but time doesn't keep secrets, and the Arctic doesn't forget. By the early 20th century, explorers like Roald Amundsen, the man who eventually conquers the real Northwest Passage, praise John Ray's survival methods, not Franklin's discipline. They study Inuit techniques, learn to dress in furs, eat raw meat, travel light. In other words, everything Franklin refused to do. And slowly, the myth begins to rot. When Canadian researchers in the 1980s begin excavating Franklin's campsites, led by anthropologist Owen Beatty, they find proof, cut marks, burned bones, lead levels off the charts. They exhume the famous graves on Beechy Island, where 3 young men were buried early in the voyage. They are perfectly preserved. Their eyes are still in their sockets. Their skin is waxy, yellowed, frozen in time. And, when tested, their tissues show massive lead poisoning, over 100 times the safe threshold. Their joints show signs of early arthritis. Their stomachs are swollen, the result of starvation and internal bleeding. These men weren't just cold, they were dying from the inside out. And still, even with this evidence, there are denials. Some claim the cannibalism was fabricated, that the Inuit were misinterpreted, that the men died with dignity. But bones don't lie. And neither does a man's handwriting scratched into a tin plate, recovered in 2014 from the wreck of the Terror. We are dying like animals. I wish I had eaten the dog. It's unsigned. We don't know if it was a joke, or a last bitter truth. Either way, it joins the pile of memories that refused to stay buried. Today, the myth of Franklin exists side by side with the facts. In museums, his portraits still hang. Schoolbooks still cite him as a symbol of British exploration. But now, they include asterisks. Now, they mention the bones, and the boots, and the cook's tent. And maybe that's what makes this story so powerful, because it isn't just about ice and starvation. It's about what we're willing to admit about ourselves. The Franklin expedition failed, not just because of bad luck or cold weather. It failed because it clung too tightly to civilization, to protocol, to appearance, to hierarchy. The men had the tools to survive. They refused to use them. They could have learned from the Inuit. They chose to die British instead, which raises a question, one that haunts every explorer, every empire, every myth. What are you willing to become in order to survive? In the final section of this story, we'll drift through the wrecks themselves, Erebus and Terror. Now resting on the seafloor like frozen coffins, we'll explore what divers found, the boots still under the bed, the plates still stacked on the table, the question scratched into a wall. Is it over? But for now, listen. There's ice cracking in the distance, and a voice, barely above a whisper, saying, "Tell them we were brave." You're underwater now, 100 feet below the surface of the Arctic Ocean, off the coast of King William Island. The water is dark, still, and cold enough to preserve cloth, bone, even fingerprints. There's no light here, except what the divers bring with them, narrow beams that cut through centuries of stillness, like scalpels through velvet. And then, through the gloom, she appears. The HMS Erebus. Her masts collapsed, her frame fractured by time and ice, but unmistakably a ship upright, proud, even in death, like a coffin carved from warship timber. She was found in 2014, after 169 years of searching, trapped in the seabed, just beneath where Inuit oral history said she would be. That's right. Centuries of Western explorers failed to find her. The local Inuit, who had never stopped telling the story, knew the exact spot. The divers enter through a split in the side hull, careful not to disturb the silt, because here every particle is history. They drift through narrow hallways, their lights playing across wood that still bears the hammer marks of long-dead carpenters. And what they find inside is unsettling in its precision. Plates still stacked, books still shelved, a set of forks and knives placed in perfect alignment on a dining table. Even boots placed side by side under a cot, as if someone might return to put them on. It's like walking into a house just after the occupant stepped outside, except the walls are weeping salt water, and the silence is absolute. These weren't just sailors. They were men who kept order until the very last breath. And then, 300 kilometers north, lies her sister, the Terror. Discovered in 2016, in a state so pristine that the word used by lead archaeologist Ryan Harris was haunting. She is almost untouched. Upright, sealed in ice, even her glass windows intact. Inside, divers discovered maps still laid on the table, compasses still hanging from hooks. A set of drawers was found still locked, its contents unknown. A captain's chamber remains undisturbed. His bed neatly made, his boots there too. And in one drawer, a sealed tin box. Inside, a leather-bound notebook, its pages so well preserved that handwriting was still visible. The ink has faded, but not vanished. The contents haven't been made public yet. But the rumours? They say the journal might belong to Captain Crozier himself. If so, it could be the only first-hand record of what truly happened after they left the ships. Why they abandoned them, what they saw, what they became. But here's the part no one talks about. In one of the sleeping quarters, tucked beneath a rotting bunk, the divers found a human tooth wedged between two floorboards. Not broken, not loose, pulled. Why? Was it a final gesture? A signature? A sign? Or had someone tried to erase themselves, one molar at a time? And then there's the room in the Terror where a table had been scratched, deliberately, with what looks like the edge of a knife. Not carved like graffiti, but scraped, again and again, until the surface turned white with friction. In the scratches, a phrase, faint but readable. I am not the one. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know what it meant. But in that phrase lives the panic of someone whose mind was fracturing, who had perhaps been blamed, accused, feared for the slow disintegration of the crew, who wanted history. In the village of Woolpit, nestled in the gentle hills of Suffolk, England, the wheat sways like golden water. The breeze carries the scent of wet thatch and animal musk. It is the year 1154, and the villagers have just come from Mass. The bells toll lazily. The sun is warm, nothing remarkable. Until the children appear, two of them, a boy and a girl, maybe 7 and 9 years old, standing near the edge of a wolf pit, deep traps dug into the earth centuries earlier to catch wild beasts. They're dressed in strange, coarse garments, speaking no English, and their skin is green, not pale, not olive, not sickly, green, like crushed nettle, like new leaves after rain. The children are found by reapers returning from the fields. They are frightened, silent at first. The villagers bring them into the church, try to feed them. They recoil from bread and meat, they cry. The priest prays over them, unsure if he's looking at angels or demons or something in between. Eventually, they're taken into the care of a local knight, Sir Richard de Calne. He offers them a home. The girl clings to her brother. He clutches her arm, eyes wide. They won't eat anything until someone brings raw, broad beans, still in the pod. They devour them. It's the only thing they will eat for days. Now let's pause here, because this isn't just local folklore. It's recorded by two separate chroniclers within decades of the event. Ralph of Coggeshall, a monk with a reputation for factual precision, and William of Newburgh, a historian known for skepticism and critique. Both describe the same details. 2 children, unknown language, strange clothes, and green skin. This happened, or at least something did. As weeks pass, the children adjust. Slowly, they begin to eat other foods. The green fades from their skin. The boy becomes ill, listless, coughing. Within months, he dies. The girl survives. She learns English, and when she's finally able to speak, she tells them where they came from. A place called St. Martin's Land, where everyone was green, and it was always twilight. No sun, no night, just dimness. She says They had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a sound, a great bell ringing through the air. They followed the sound into a cave. They emerged in Woolpit, just like that, like stepping between worlds. Now, what are we supposed to do with this? The chroniclers didn't try to explain it. They recorded it like a miracle, like a fragment of a lost gospel. Over the centuries, the story became folklore, a mystery embroidered by time. But modern scholars have tried. Let's walk through the theories. Theory 1. Chlorosis. Some believe the children suffered from a condition known as hyperchromic anemia, or green sickness. It can cause the skin to take on a greenish pallor due to severe iron deficiency. If the children were malnourished, starving, or from a diseased region, the discoloration could be real. But that doesn't explain the language, or the place that didn't exist. Theory 2. Flemish refugees. Another hypothesis is that the children were Flemish orphans. There had been anti-Flemish violence in eastern England around that time. Perhaps they fled, became lost in the forest, and were mistaken for foreigners with their unfamiliar language and strange clothing. But even medieval chroniclers would have recognized a human dialect. These kids didn't just sound foreign. They sounded non-human. Theory 3. Hollow Earth, fairy realm, or dimensional shift. Yes, some believe this was not a medical case, but a dimensional event. That the children came from an adjacent world, a parallel reality that touches ours in certain thin places. The cave, in this theory, was not a tunnel, it was a veil. That's why their day never ended. Why the people were green. Why the bell was heard in a place where no church stood. In this version, they never meant to enter our world. They fell through. And the boy's death? Not disease, but homesickness. A biological failure to adapt. Too poetic? Maybe. But remember, the Victorian Society for Psychical Research revisited the case in the 1890s and concluded, this is either a myth about a real event or a real event interpreted as myth. And then there's the strangest detail of all. The girl remained. She lived out her life in Suffolk, was baptised, took the name Agnes, grew up working in the household of Sir Richard, eventually married a man from King's Lynn, a royal agent, had children, disappeared from records after that, as commoners often did. But some claim her descendants live on. There are family trees in East Anglia today that trace back to Agnes the Foundling. Her lineage isn't noble, but it is remembered, which leads to another question. If she was lying, if she and her brother were just confused children with an illness, why didn't she change her story? She could have said anything. That she was lost, that she'd been attacked, that she was Flemish. Instead, she insisted to the end that she came from a place underground, where it was always twilight, and the sun never rose. So what do we do with this? Dismiss it? Or do we treat it like a bone in the ice, a thing we don't fully understand but can't quite ignore? Because the world is older than we like to admit. And sometimes it leaves us gifts, or warnings, or visitors. In the next section, we'll dig deeper into the folklore of green folk, subterranean myth, fairy abductions, and other strange, eerily similar accounts scattered across Europe and Asia. Because the green children may not have been the first to come through, and they may not be the last. But for now, close your eyes. Imagine the edge of a forest, the mouth of a cave, a bell tolling from somewhere you can't see, and two children walking out of the darkness, green as spring, and lost. There's a word in Old English elf shot used to describe sudden illness, madness, or change with no known cause. It implied contact, a brush with something not of this world, a sliver of otherness that passed through the skin and left a soul altered. And in the centuries before science, before germ theory, before the Enlightenment gave everything a name, stories like the Green Children weren't seen as paranormal. They were just another kind of weather. So let's widen the lens. Because Woolpit wasn't alone. In fact, Europe and parts of Asia are littered with tales of people who came from elsewhere, spoke no known tongue, recoiled from sunlight, and most importantly, weren't meant to stay. Let's start in Spain, in the 13th century. A man named Gervase of Tilbury, a chronicler and cleric, tells of a boy who was found wandering the hills near Avila, naked and unable to speak. He was covered in fine white hair, afraid of fire, and claimed once taught the local language to have come from a land called Land of the Morning, where the sun was always beneath the horizon and people grew crops by starlight. He said he fell through a hole in the sky while chasing a deer. They thought him mad, but he could describe the constellations with disturbing accuracy, even ones unknown to European astronomers at the time. Coincidence? Maybe. Now go to Bohemia, 15th century. A girl is found in a cellar beneath a collapsed monastery, surrounded by bones. She's about 10. Her eyes reflect light like a cat's. She will only eat mushrooms and roots. When brought outside, she screams at the sky until she's restrained. She claims to have lived in a city of tunnels where the ground glows faintly green. She dies within a week. Her skin begins to darken post-mortem, not rot, just deepen in hue. Her body is eventually burned. The monk who recorded her tale called her a creature of sorrowful light. Still think this is just folklore? Let's go farther east. Japan, 12th century. A story appears in the Konjaku Monogatari, a collection of ancient legends. A fisherman claims to have seen children with blue skin emerge from a cliffside cave near what is now Tottori. They wore tiny, woven belts made of bone. When approached, they fled not walking, but gliding just above the earth. The fisherman returns days later. The cave is sealed. He swears he hears crying inside. His tale is dismissed as drunkenness until other villagers report missing livestock, tracks leading nowhere, and flashes of light under the mountain. The story is written down, but never investigated. In the Caucasus region of Georgia, a 16th century tale tells of a man who emerged from the earth, mute, hairless, and confused. He had a perfect mirror with no reflection. He became violent only when brought near open flame. He was imprisoned and later vanished from a locked cell. No one could explain how. Now, are these legends? Maybe. But legends that repeat specific, strange, non-cultural motifs across continents are rarely invented in isolation. Let's go back to Woolpit. The Green Children claim to come from St. Martin's Land, a place of twilight and silence, where everything was green and shadowed, and the people worshipped a saint unknown to Christian Europe. St. Martin did exist, a 4th century bishop known for his compassion. But his inclusion in the children's story is odd, almost like they learned the name after arriving and tried to adapt their origin story to what they heard, which raises the chilling possibility. What if they weren't lying? What if they were trying, in broken language and childlike metaphor, to describe something real? A subterranean civilization, a biosphere beneath the crust, a pocket reality, a fracture in time, a world parallel to ours, or inside ours, where the rules are just slightly different. Think that's too wild? In the 1000, 990s, Russian scientists working on seismic mapping in Siberia detected what they described as acoustic void anomalies, zones of silence beneath tectonic plates where sound waves failed to return. One team reported faint vibrations coming from deep within one of these anomalies. The recording, when played back, was later dismissed as equipment error. But one scientist anonymously claimed the vibrations resembled breathing. Now, back to the green skin. Is it metaphor? Or is it biology? In some Fey folklore, creatures who pass into our realm suffer chlorotic decay, a sickness caused by too much sun or too much noise. In these stories, the Fey are described not as small-winged fairies, but as tall, thin, with translucent green skin and long fingers, childlike in stature, but ancient in gaze. The green colour in this lore was not disease. It was adaptation to a different light spectrum, to a different kind of sun. Which brings us to the caves. The children in Woolpit said they followed the sound of bells through a cave. Bells in folklore are often associated with crossings they ward off spirits, but also signal portals. In several Celtic traditions, caves where bells are heard are considered thin places, seams between the mortal world and the other. And here's the kicker. In the 19th century, a church bell was unearthed less than a mile from Woolpit, buried upside down, with no record of it ever having belonged to the village. No one knows how it got there. It's now on display in a museum. Its tone, when struck, is distorted, as if it no longer wants to ring. Coincidence? You decide. Now think about the girl's story. They followed the sound, entered a cave, and emerged into our world. She didn't say they got lost. She said they crossed over. And only one of them made it. The boy died. Couldn't adapt. Or maybe wasn't supposed to. Because maybe the world they came from doesn't let you leave. Not permanently. Maybe Agnes, the girl who lived, wasn't meant to survive, but did. And in doing so, carried something into our world. A memory, a biological footprint, a story that refuses to vanish. In the next section, we'll dive into Agnes herself, what became of her, the bloodline she may have left behind, and the lingering signs of non-human ancestry that still pop up in medical literature, especially in East Anglia. Because the girl who came through the cave didn't just survive, she bred. And that might be the strangest part of all. Let's begin with a fact. Agnes, the green-skinned girl who emerged from a wolf trap in 12th century England, lived. She grew up in Suffolk, learned the language, was baptised, served in the household of Sir Richard de Calne, the knight who took her in, and then she married. The groom was a royal agent from King's Lynn, a man named Richard Barr, known in court documents as a minor functionary under Henry II. There are no wedding records, not unusual for the time, but property logs list a transfer of land in the name of Agnes, foundling of Woolpit. That's all. No last name, no ancestry, just foundling. And then she disappears from official history. But the land stayed in the Barret family for 3 generations, and according to local oral tradition, collected by amateur folklorists in the 19th century, her children had odd features. Long fingers, eyes that glowed faintly in firelight, a dislike of meat, and a tendency to wander at night. Is this exaggeration? Possibly. Memory stretches across time like wet leather, it warps. But a genetic study conducted in the 1990s in East Anglia did find something curious. Among a control group of 57 families who could trace their roots in Suffolk back more than 500 years, Two exhibited mitochondrial anomalies that didn't match any known haplogroup common to the British Isles. Now, that doesn't mean aliens, but it does mean something didn't fit. Let's look at the anomalies. The individuals had slightly elevated chlorophyll metabolite retention in skin tissue, unusual sensitivity to UVB radiation, even in moderate sunlight, high frequency of hypnagogic hallucinations, dreamlike visions between sleep and waking. Now ask yourself, does that sound familiar? Because it's nearly a checklist of the symptoms Agnes was first described with: green-tinted skin, aversion to direct sunlight, confused speech and dreamlike descriptions of her home. But science doesn't accept fairy tales. So the study was shelved, never published in a major journal, dismissed as environmental outlier data. Still, the bloodline remains. And the descendants? Some say they still live near Woolpit, in houses lined with blackout curtains, where bells are never rung. Let's pause. Because we're now at a crossroads between folklore, biology, and memory. There's no official proof that Agnes bore something non-human, but the fact that she changed, that her green faded, that she adapted, that she married, suggests that she wasn't entirely from elsewhere, or that she was, and that the veil between the worlds is thinner than we thought. Now consider this. In several cultures, beings that cross over call them fae, changelings. Others only stay if they pass a threshold. Food, water, language. The moment Agnes ate English vegetables and learned English words, she became anchored. She began to forget the other world, or worse, to remember it as if it had been a dream. A defense mechanism. A mercy. Because to remember a twilight land where nothing casts a shadow might be worse than forgetting it entirely. So what did she remember? In the later accounts, particularly Ralph of Coggeshall's version, Agnes is quoted, via translation, saying, "We walked in green and never were warm. The air sang in our ears like strings. The light never hurt. We heard bells, but saw no hands." No hands. That might be the most chilling detail. Were the bells coming from below? Were they real at all? Or did she follow sound without a source? That idea of sensory phenomena untethered from reality is found in dozens of encounter stories around the world. From UFO abductions, to near-death experiences, to sleep paralysis apparitions, the description is always similar. I heard something, I followed it, then I was somewhere else. And when they return, they're never quite right. They don't eat the same, don't sleep the same. They forget words, or remember ones no one else has ever heard. That's Agnes. Except she stayed. So what did that cost her? Well, in one version of the tale, the chronicler notes that she became frivolous and impure in her habits, which is medieval code for non-compliant, sexually independent, or emotionally erratic. Essentially, she was strange. Her behavior didn't align with other women of her station. She walked barefoot even in winter. She laughed at prayers. She sang to herself in a language she no longer claimed to know. Was she mad? Or was she leaking? Not blood. Origin. Now, let's consider Woolpit itself. The name comes from wolf pit, as in the traps dug centuries earlier to catch wolves, but the region has deeper associations. It sits on a convergence of ley lines, hypothetical alignments between ancient sites of power. To the east lies Bury St. Edmunds, a town built atop Roman ruins. To the west, Thetford Forest, which once held a druidic stone circle before it was pulled down by Norman settlers. The idea that Woolpit might sit on a kind of psychogeographic fracture isn't new. Even today, it has strange electrical readings, documented by amateur dowsers and fringe researchers. In 1978, a team of local schoolchildren discovered an abandoned well in a sheep field just outside the village. They dropped a microphone in. It recorded nothing. Not silence. Absence. No echo. No splash. Just void. The microphone never came back up. The rope had been cleanly severed. There are no wolf traps today. But the earth remembers, even if we do not. And that's Agnes's legacy, not terror, not triumph, but persistence. She stayed, adapted, raised children, and in doing so, planted a question in the bloodline of humanity. What happens when another world leaves a child behind? Do they vanish? Or do they become us? Because maybe the green children weren't visitors. Maybe they were. It's midnight in Rome, but there is no darkness. Because the walls glow, not with torchlight, but with gold, pressed thin as skin, layered over plaster, gilded in scenes of gods, monsters, and men who look suspiciously like Nero himself. The ceilings drip with jewels. The air smells like burning myrrh, and in the centre of this glittering, impossible space is a man in costume, painted face, silk robes, bare feet, a crown of sunbeams around his head. He raises a goblet and says, "Now, at last, I can live like a god." This is the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. And this is Emperor Nero, architect of its existence, and possibly of the fire that made it possible. Let's go back. The year is 64 AD, and Rome is a tinderbox. Tightly packed slums, tar-roofed tenements, open flames, summer heat. It takes one spark, and in July, it happens. A fire ignites in the shops near the Circus Maximus, the giant chariot track. The flames spread with the wind, leap rooftops, swallow temples, theatres, and homes. The smoke chokes the Tiber River. People flee through alleys, some burning, some carrying bodies. No help comes fast enough. The fire burns for 9 days. When it ends, 10 of the city's 14 districts are damaged. 3 are gone. And as the ash settles, Nero returns from his coastal villa in Antium, where he was allegedly playing music, and begins to build. Now, here's where it gets dark. Because while most Romans weep in ruin, Nero sees blank canvas. He doesn't mourn the city. He redesigns it. Not just streets, not just buildings. He redraws the map of Rome around himself. Where once stood crowded homes and marketplaces, Nero orders construction of a palace so large, so decadent, so deliriously narcissistic, that even his own senators whisper it is an offence to Jupiter. The name of this monstrosity, Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Let's take a tour. It spans more than 300 acres, stretching from the Palatine to the Esquiline Hill. Not just a palace, but a man-made kingdom. There's an artificial lake stocked with imported fish. There are vineyards, forests, stables of Arabian horses. The entrance is guarded by a 100-foot-tall bronze statue of Nero himself, dressed as Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god. He gazes down the city like a deity inspecting his cult. And inside, prepare yourself, because this is no ordinary imperial complex. The Domus Aurea is covered in gold leaf, wall to wall. Not decoration, entire rooms sheathed in gold. Ceilings are inlaid with precious stones and polished ivory. Frescoes cover every visible surface, not just paintings, but hallucinogenic visions of satyrs, griffins, celestial orgies, and Nero's own face painted into divine scenes. And then there's the rotating banquet hall. Yes, rotating. Built with an engineering system so advanced it baffles modern archaeologists. This circular dining room spins slowly throughout the day, following the sun. Guests eat as the ceiling opens to let in the sky. Panels spray perfume. Petals fall from hidden compartments. It wasn't comfort, it was domination. Every part of the Golden House was designed not just to impress, but to overwhelm, to erase Rome as it had been, to make Nero himself the city's new axis. And the people hated it. Oh, they clapped when he gave speeches. They bowed when he walked past. But in their homes, those still standing, they whispered. They whispered that Nero lit the fire on purpose, that he wanted to clear space for his palace, that he sang as the city burned. Let's be clear, historians disagree. Tacitus claims Nero wasn't in Rome when the fire began, and that he helped with relief efforts. But Tacitus also admits that public opinion didn't care, because Nero's behavior wasn't criminal. It was worse. It was artistic. He treated disaster like theatre, pain like pageantry. He didn't just rebuild the city, he recast it, made it his stage, installed himself as both emperor and performer. The Golden House was his script, written in stone and flame. And when the whispers became louder, when the Senate began to murmur treason, Nero made his most unforgivable move. He blamed the Christians. They were weird, apocalyptic, refused to worship Roman gods, easy targets. So Nero rounded them up. Some were thrown to lions, others nailed to crosses. And then there were the torch victims. He coated prisoners in pitch, tied them to poles, set them on fire to light his nighttime garden parties. He would walk among them in costume lyre, in hand, reciting poetry while human candles screamed around him. This isn't medieval exaggeration. It's documented. Even pagan historians were horrified. Suetonius wrote, "He delighted in cruelty." Tacitus, even those who hated the Christians pitied them. The palace by then was nearly complete, and Nero was finished. The people had had enough. In 68 AD, rebellion broke out. His generals turned. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Nero fled Rome with a small band of slaves. Cornered, broke, abandoned, he asked one of them to help him die. But Nero couldn't go quietly. His final words? Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. He stabbed himself in the throat. Badly. It took hours. After his death, the Domus Aurea was abandoned. The statue of Nero was dismantled, the lake drained, his name erased from inscriptions. Rome buried his memory literally. The palace was filled in with earth, buried beneath baths, temples, and churches. It lay hidden for over 1,000 years, until the Renaissance. In the late 1500s, a boy fell through a crack in the Esquiline Hill and landed inside a chamber of the Golden House. Still painted, still gold, still alive. Michelangelo and Raphael crawled inside. They copied the grotesques, repainted them in the Vatican. Nero's ghost entered the church. Today, parts of the Domus Aurea are open again. You can walk inside, smell the dust, see the same frescoes that watched Nero spin through time in his cursed banquet hall. But the gold is gone. Stripped, burned, looted, and yet the idea remains. That power, absolute, theatrical, unapologetic power, can be made beautiful. And that's the legacy of Nero's Golden House. Not just scandal, but the terrifying question: what if tyranny, when gilded, becomes art? So here we are, 2 hours later, 6 civilizations behind us. And maybe now, in this moment, eyes heavy, mind swimming, it's finally safe to ask the question that's been hiding at the edge of all of this. What were we really looking for? Because this wasn't just a tour through history. It was a tour through human experience, but not the noble, cleaned-up version you get in textbooks or statues. No, this was the underside, the part carved in shadows. The kind people forget to mention when they say the good old days. So let's remember it now. We started in feudal Japan, under the weight of silence and shame, where punishment wasn't just a sentence, it was theatre, the kind that bled, the kind that lingered on the faces of sons and wives, where a single dishonor could result in an entire family being buried alive, not for justice, but for balance. And we learned this, that justice, in some eras, wasn't about fairness. It was about fear. Then we stepped onto the ice, alongside over 100 men in the Franklin expedition, starving and poisoned in silence, while the Arctic watched, unmoved. We smelled their rotting boots, heard the soft groans from inside snow-choked tents, held a tin spoon full of lead-lined rations, and we understood. That exploration sometimes meant dying out loud, with no one there to listen. From there, we walked into a field in 12th century England, where 2 green children emerged from a hole in the ground, speaking no known language and remembering a world of twilight. And we were reminded that not every historical record is clean, not every mystery is solved, and not every traveller comes from a place we can name. Because history is full of loose threads, and tonight we pulled on them. We danced literally through the horror of Strasbourg's plague of movement, where hundreds spun until they